Well, hello. We have a doubly difficult session because it's the second last session before drinks and the end of the day. Plus, we're talking about economic principles. So, a bit of a double whammy there. We'll try not to make you fall asleep, but not making any promises, no. Before I go on, I'd like to thank ISCA for putting on such a wonderful event. It's really important for organisations, I guess you could say client organisations like Transport for New South Wales, to learn lessons from other states, from other projects, and of course from international organisations and projects also. So it's very insightful, very important for us, as well as to reconnect with the sustainability family, as I like to call it. So it's been wonderful. Jonas and I are going to talk about... Oh, I didn't put my slide up. Okay, I knew I was going to have a challenge with this one. Hang on, here we go. We're going to talk about what I consider to be a very important piece of work. It's the recent triple bottom line evaluation of our draft sustainable design guidelines. It's an important piece of work because it's about demonstrating the value proposition for our sustainability program, of which the guidelines are a very, very integral part. So just to provide some context for you, we're fortunate to be sustainability managers, and I'm looking at other of my colleagues around the room, in an organisation that has a very rich or deep policy context for sustainability. We, as a state government agency, have to conform to the OEH, Office of Environment and Heritage, Government Resource Efficiency Policy, so that's a broader driver for us. We then have the New South Wales Long-Term Transport Master Plan, which includes specific reference to sustainability issues such as sustainable procurement, which has been a key topic today. We have a policy framework for sustainability. We have an environment and sustainability policy signed by our Secretary, Tim Reardon. And we have some other documents that relate to the broader policy context. I should also mention that we're fortunate to have strong leadership commitment within the organisation for sustainability. For our Western Australian friends here today, Stephen Troughton, who was the CEO of Main Roads WA, is now one of the Deputy Secretaries at Transport for New South Wales. And he's come on board to lead the Infrastructure and Services Division, which is the division that I sit in. And his two focus points, or focal points, which he keeps bringing up in different forums, is sustainability and innovation. So again, a pretty good place to be for the sustainability community at the moment. The value proposition work that Jonas will be talking in more detail about is on our Sustainable Design Guidelines version 4. So SDG, not to be confused with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is what the acronym was used for earlier. And a bit of a background. First of all, put your hands up if you've had anything to do with the guidelines, Sustainable Design Guidelines, or you know of the Sustainable Design Guidelines. Yeah, so I'd say probably about 60, 70%. The guidelines actually are older, if you like, have been around longer than the IS rating scheme. They are our key framework for embedding sustainability on our projects for issues that are material to Transport for New South Wales. And our key framework for embedding practically our policy objectives. These guidelines relate only to public transport projects, I should note, not to our roads projects at this point. They have been around since 2009 and we've had a number of versions, so we're now up to version 4. So we've got the draft version 4. We've reached a level of maturity whereby we've taken feedback from industry in applying the previous versions of the guidelines. And importantly, they are much more streamlined with the IS rating tool. The IS rating tool is applied to projects greater than 50 million capital value. These guidelines apply to all of our projects, so they're scalable to smaller projects as well as our larger projects, and they are complementary. Okay, I think that's... So in terms of the value proposition, we have a history of demonstrating the value proposition in terms of economic terms for our versions of the guidelines previous to version 4. So in 2012, we did a study of Glenfield Station commuter car park, That was involving the division at that time, Transport Projects. We had independent review from Ray Payne, who was part of London 2012, and Edge Environment, where Jonas is from, undertook that work. Similarly, we did Glenfield to Leppington Rail Link in 2015, and it was the same stakeholders involved in that work. Now we've reached a level of maturity or a continuous improvement in the value proposition work that we're doing, and we have involved a number of stakeholders across Transport for New South Wales in that work, both in the development of the assumptions underpinning the economic evaluation, as well as reviewing the outputs of the work. So it's had a lot of hands in the mix, making sure that it's fit for purpose, making sure it reflects our economic guidelines in terms of the metrics applied. And it was a bit of a secondary objective, which could actually be a primary objective, was to help do a bit of change management with those individuals within those divisions and enable them a better understanding of what we're doing in the sustainability program. So I'll leave it now to... Oh, sorry, I should mention also that the latest value proposition work that Jonas is going to talk you through has also had independent review from one of our life cycle costing specialist consultants, WT Partnerships, who are also doing life cycle costing work on a number of our other projects. So we have a high level of confidence in the results of this work. Okay, Jonas.
Thanks, Jane. So I'm going to talk through what we assessed and how we did it, and to give a snapshot of the results. So basically what we looked at, we applied a Sustainable Design Guidelines version 4 on a station, Edmondson Park Interchange asset. So looking at the station and the car park around it. So that was the scope of the assessment. And then we looked at the 14 compulsory requirements within the new SDGs. So they range from basically construction greenhouse gas emissions to urban design, improved urban design, procurement, climate change risk, energy management, waste, water, etc. And each of these compulsory requirements, they have different levels of performance. So they stipulate a benchmark, which is the minimum compliance for each of them. But then you can have up to 5 different levels. So performance level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for some of the credits. So we established what was the minimum, what's the benchmark of the station that we're looking at. What would be a performance level 1, which would be a pass in the design guidelines terminology. What would be a silver asset? And finally, what would be a platinum station if you went all out on the maximum on all of the credits. And then also, as the final one, looking at what was actually built, because the station is up and running and commissioned. So how did they perform? And they obviously didn't perform as uniform as all performance 1. It was a bit of a mix across the different levels. And then we went about breaking down each of the credit. And as Jane mentioned, we had intense engagement with experts and stakeholders within each of these areas. So looking at, for example, if it's a greenhouse gas credits, what are different ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, 5%, 10%, 15%? What are the different initiatives, talking with relevant expert there? In terms of climate change risk, we sat down and say, well, what does performance level 1 versus 5 mean here, and what initiatives can you put in place? And when it comes to improved urban design, it's not so much about emissions and materials. It's more about how do you achieve, what type of outcomes can you achieve with improved urban design. It's probably more about time saving for the patrons, etc. And procurements, it's more about creating local jobs and stimulating the economy. So depending on which credit it is, we sat down with the experts and worked out what the different performance levels looked like and costed them in terms of what would it cost to achieve the different levels. And then we applied a triple bottom line approach. So we applied the life cycle costing, just basically looking at the CapEx and OpEx of this asset. Standard life cycle costing approach, which most people are familiar with. But then we also broadened it out and looked at the environmental life cycle assessment story, so looking at the traditional LCA applied to these initiatives, measuring all the resources and all the emissions and all the water and waste across the life cycle, which would be 50 years for this station. and then applying social return on investment, like Nicole spoke about before. So that's an established methodology to look at what's the return on investment for the social benefits that's applied and achieved through this project, also called wider economic benefits, but the strict term would probably be social return on investment. So that would be a triple bottom line approach, and the idea was to monetize everything. Initially, people find this challenging. They want to talk about carbon, they want to talk about urban smog, and they want to talk about materials and recyclability and job creations and time savings, but there's a bit of a reluctance to put monetary values on it. But Transport for New South Wales have published really good guidelines about actually costing up these wider economic benefits and externalities. So a lot of the metrics that we got out were quite easy to find good proxy values that actually was used by Transport for their own business case development. And what we applied was obviously look at pure CapEx and OpEx that's already given in terms of dollar values. And then we look at the operational spend over 50 years and discounted back into net present value. We look at carbon pollution, applying Transport's price for carbon, which would be about $54, $55 per ton. Looking at urban smog, particulate emission, etc. A lot of economic proxies, looking at an overall metric of how all these environmental impacts affect human health, and looking at the disability-adjusted life here, basically taking a life of health away from the population, and what would be the cost to the society for doing that. Looking at time savings, so improved urban design, for example, improve the flow of passengers within the station, what would be the potential cost saving and time saving. And Transport applies a value for working people, which would be higher than when you're on your own private time. So looking at those different differentiators. All about putting monetary value on this to cut across having to work with multiple metrics. And then looking at each credit, I'm just going to give you a snapshot of one, which is the greenhouse gas and carbon reduction, construction carbon reduction. The different performance levels here is performance level 1 compared to the benchmark is a 5% reduction in carbon emissions. Performance level 2 is 10, etc. So then we sat down with the relevant experts and stakeholders and said, well, what would you do if you only had to reduce 5%? Which initiatives would you undertake? And they would say, well, typically you can value engineer out some carbon in terms of being more materially efficient. Perhaps we can put in some more, Portland cement substitution. The next level up might be involving using biodiesel, a blend in your construction machinery. And then it might be even around strategic sourcing, looking at environmental product declarations for different materials and comparing, if I source the steel from this manufacturer which has published their EPDs, for example, BlueScope and One Steel, what would be the carbon saving for procuring from this specific manufacturer compared to another manufacturer? And using these EPDs is a really good tool to work within procurement and actually quantify some benefits. And these EPDs are available from many of the major construction materials around Australia. I think all Australian-made steel carry EPDs at the moment, all plastic pipes manufactured in Australia, all timber, etc. So that's a great resource to apply life cycle assessment and life cycle thinking to procurement. So sitting down for each of these credits and working out what would you do to reach these levels in a normal scenario, and then costing it up. So what we're looking at here is the different levels of reduction in carbon. What would be the spend in terms of CapEx? Since this is construction energy and construction carbon, there wouldn't be any operational impacts. It would just be a CapEx expenditure in order to achieve this. But then costing in, what's the externality saving? So reducing carbon pollution and reducing carbon emissions, what would be the proxy value for that? And basically working out each performance level, what's the CapEx expenditure, and what's the externality cost, what's the payback in terms of environmental savings. So that's the principle we applied, illustrated on one of the credits, on all the different 14 mandatory credits in the SDGs. And then also benchmarking. So it's nice to see Lang and Rourke up here talking about procurement, etc. We looked at what the difference, what's the level of ambition out there in terms of carbon reduction for relevant organizations. So knowing that the SDGs stipulated about 25%, how does that fit in, broadly speaking, with what organizations put out or in terms of commitments? Now, noting that these are all with different scope and different time frames. but it ranges from roughly 5 to up to 30%. So I think 25% for level 5 is a reasonable kind of level of ambition for transport to put in there. Potentially they could push it a little bit further, but it's not. It seems like an appropriate range. And then looking at what does the different levels now deliver in terms of primarily carbon savings, or initially carbon savings. So we would have the benchmark, and then scenario 1, which would be pass, silver, platinum. And as you would expect, the SDGs do deliver carbon savings overall in terms of all the SDGs put together, all the 14 credits. You have a significant carbon reduction across the board. The other environmental impacts that we measure, such as smog, urban pollution, water usage, etc., they all follow the same trend. Improving the level of SDG performance does deliver results when you measure it using, in this term, life cycle assessment. And putting it all together into disability-adjusted life year. So what's the end result in terms of human health between the different levels? And you can see a saving of the health of the population by up to 32% if you went to the platinum level of the SDGs. So the SDGs, they do deliver quantifiable results. Now, in terms of costing this up, to the left-hand side, you have the pure life cycle costing. So just putting CapEx and OpEx over 50 years, discounting it back. How much does it cost you to go from doing basically nothing to doing all-in platinum sustainability? And as you can see, there's hardly any difference when you look at the life cycle cost. Doing nothing costs roughly as much as doing a platinum-rated asset. If anything, you save a small percentage of cost over the life of the asset. But then applying what you have to the right here is the costed externalities and wider economic benefits. Then you can see a significant saving and a significant benefit in terms of going all the way to platinum-rated assets. So difference between pure life cycle cost and going to the full business case and the full assessment, including externalities and wider economic benefits. Running out of time. Okay, so final one is just to acknowledge that these benefits that are distributed across some of them, which you see in the inner circle here, is for the project scope. So a lot of the costs are borne by the project. Some of the benefits are returned to the project, but the real significant benefits in terms of environmental and social improvements goes to the community around, which wouldn't necessarily be capitalized straight from the project balance sheet. And that's really important for a government entity to take into consideration and see that, actually look at it more holistically in terms of the benefits delivered. Now, final remarks. I think this demonstrates, even if it's only one asset, that there is a very strong business case for improving sustainability using the SDGs. And also acknowledging that it's not a linear thing, that the improvement going from nothing to silver is not necessarily as much as the improvement from going to silver to gold. Somehow there seems going all the way into sustainability is when you get all the synergies and you really see the benefits come together, which is why platinum really had a big step in terms of delivering outcomes. So I think that's important to recognize.
And just quickly to wrap up, that third point is that, yes, externalities are important, and as a government agency we need to be cognizant of that and trying to reduce externalities and think of the cost to a project as the true cost or the more representative cost, which is more around not just the financials. But is it affordable? We still need to put an affordability lens on everything that we do, particularly if we have great initiatives that require maintenance. Do we have sufficient budget for maintenance? Because if we don't, those benefits are not actually going to be realised. So the aim of the guidelines is to have a cost neutral or a reduced life cycle cost. Important to consider who pays and who benefits, which Jonas mentioned, and the ability to quantify the triple bottom line is really important, and that really value add piece of this work. Instead of just talking qualitatively about the benefits, we can actually talk in monetary terms, and that is a really powerful tool to affect change. just a couple more things. We are supplementing this work with a test of the draft guidelines on Penrith Station upgrades. So we're taking a concept design, applying the guidelines through a rapid design process, and also through that work developing a lifecycle costing tool, which project teams will be able to use as part of applying the guidelines in the future. Going to be rolled out early 2017 is the plan, so watch this space. And just to note, we are sharing this knowledge across other government agencies, including OEH and Health Infrastructure, Department of Education, and DFSI, to try and get a more government-aligned approach to the quantification of sustainability benefits. And that is all. Thank you.